In this next set of classes, we'll be looking at the ways in which Christianity has changed and modified over time. Instead of doing a straight survey of Christian history, going from the first century to the present, instead I thought I would take us on a tour of a couple of different topics and really focus on some specific topics in Christian history as opposed to just kind of a broad overview of people, places, and events. And in thinking about that, there are some important topics, I think, that affect us today that having an understanding of Christian history would be helpful in understanding a greater understanding of why things are the way they are today. In this examination, I'm not looking for you to so much have specifics, like specific people at specific times and things like that. Instead, I want you to have the broad overview of this particular topic that we're looking at in a particular class. Now, that's more of what I'm looking for. What are some things that changed and happened during a particular period in Christian history? A century, or let's say the Middle Ages or something like that. What are some of the main things that took place related to the particular topic we're investigating? Our focus for this first class is on the question of where do denominations come from? Why are there so many different religious groups that exist in our world today that all claim a Christian identity, yet they are distinct from each other? And what is it that brought this about? Why did this take place? Now, as we think about these things, there's some important things to think about. In the question of denominations, there is both an attempt to talk about the unity of Christianity, but then we also are faced with this division. And in many respects, I think we can trace division the whole way back to the very beginnings of Christianity. So in thinking about this topic, I want to start back with the Apostolic period in the first century. Now, denominations, the very existence of denominations suggests difference. If you were not different from another group, why would you have a distinct identity, a distinct name? You would be the same group. So why have a distinct name? But even when it comes to the first century, I think that we can see that there was obviously there was unity, but there was also some differences as well. So one of the first things to think about is differences among Christian believers is not necessarily a bad thing on the surface of it. All right, there can be differences. There are some areas where there can be some disagreement, or a particular congregation emphasizes something or focuses a little bit differently than another congregation, or there can be ethnic differences or racial differences, and there doesn't need to be division, right? Because denominationalism, as we see it today, is in large part reflective of division. Now, what do I mean? Well, let me give you an example of within the first century, differences among two important leaders. Of course, one of the major figures in the development of Christianity in the first century was the Apostle Paul. And he is a major figure because of his efforts at traveling around, evangelizing, being a missionary, sharing the message with Jews and Gentiles. And in his letters, of course, we see him addressing some differences among the churches that he helped establish or that he was addressing. Some of those differences are fine, right? You look at a passage like Romans 14. In Romans 14, you have a situation where Jews and Gentiles are divided over whether certain days should be observed, what kind of food should be eaten. And Paul says, well, such things are a matter of conscience, and encourages believers how to treat each other, etc. Right? So Paul is laying out for the churches that he interacts with a vision of what they are to be, how they're to be organized. But we see, when we compare Paul to someone like James, some important differences. Now, this James that we're talking about here is not James the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. Instead, this James is the half-brother of Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph, who becomes a very important leader in the church in Jerusalem. Now, when you compare what we see about James in, let's say, the book of Acts, the letter of James, and Paul, you see some important similarities. Right? There are a lot of agreement between these two. But James represents a more Jewish form of Christianity, a form of Christianity that is still holding on to certain traditions of the law of Moses, of Judaism, has abandoned certainly others. James doesn't, we have no indication that James is offering sin offerings or guilt offerings, things that other Jews would have offered, right? Because Jesus his sacrifice had done away with all those things. But he still, and many of the Jews in Jerusalem, still followed Jewish customs related to vows and related to some food laws and some things like that. So we have some slight differences between James and Paul, although there's that unity. However, not all differences, even in the first century, were acceptable. For example, while James represents a very Jewish shaped type of Christianity, one that is shaped by Jewish sensibilities, it's different than a lot of the opponents that Paul faces in various places who are attempting to Judaize Christianity. Now, what do I mean by that? It appears that there were some people who, although they had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, still wanted Gentiles to follow the law of Moses. That does not appear to be the case with James, but there were some people that claimed a Christian identity that told Gentiles they had to be circumcised, they had to follow the laws of Moses, and things like that. And Paul, of course, rejects that, is very against that, attacks such people, such people's reasoning, right, and condemns it. So while there can be some differences, you have this group that's kind of split off from apostolic Christianity and is teaching, Paul might call it a false gospel. And so, you have, it's not something we'd call a denomination, but what you have here is a split that is taking place. Furthermore, you have other groups that are developing as well, that have some similarities, or at least take some ideas from Christianity, but the apostles, the churches, are identifying these groups as teaching false doctrine, or going in a different direction, not teaching the truth. One of those groups is what we might call Docetists. Often these are connected with Gnosticism. It's not truly Gnosticism, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But essentially, what you have is this group that is spiritualizing the person of Jesus. You really get a sense for this, although you can find it in some of the letters of Paul. You really get a sense of this when you look at the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. John identifies a group of people who he calls antichrists. Right? In modern times, people use that term in a different way, but John talks about a group of antichrists, plural, who appear to be going, who appear to be going around claiming that Jesus only seemed to appear in the flesh. And that word "seemed" in Greek is where we get the term docetism. It's a Greek word that means to seem or appear. So you have this group claiming that Jesus wasn't truly human, that he only appeared to be human. And John condemns that view. So you have diversity in the 1st century. Now, some diversity is okay. Some differences are okay. Right? The differences between Paul and James was something that was fine. But then you have these other groups that are developing, that are splitting off from the main group, and often teaching things that aren't true. Now, additionally, as we see in the Apostolic period, there are some things that are present in that Apostolic period that are useful to the church. Right? The apostles are there. The men that spent that 3.5 years or so with Jesus. Right? And the authority, they're inspired people. They are guided by the Holy Spirit. Right? It's not that they're sinless, obviously, but you have this group who encountered Jesus, who can share specific things about that encounter with Jesus that other people in other places of the Roman Empire could not. Additionally, those apostles are writing down that word, and they are sending letters to churches. While we only have a few, or letters only from a few of these individuals, Peter, Paul, John, it's highly likely that the other apostles were doing something similar. And these writings, of course, would have been very important to these churches, having come from apostles, having been written by these people that encountered Jesus. And so gradually you have the development of what today is called the New Testament, this collection of these various writings. There were a lot more that were out there. Even Paul talks about in his letters other letters that we do not have anymore. They do not exist anymore. So what we have here is a collection of a certain group of letters that were very, very important. Now, as the New Testament is being brought together, of course, I believe that the Holy Spirit is guiding that process, but it is a development process. And the New Testament wasn't just handed down at one point altogether. These letters are written over some time, and they're being collected together, circulated together. Another important aspect to think about this as well is that as these apostles are starting congregations, they are developing a plurality of leadership, meaning that in a church there are several men who are in charge, who are overseeing that congregation. And it's not a singularity of leadership. There's not like them. I mean, the apostles, of course, have a lot of authority as the inspired disciples of Jesus, but as they are kind of setting up the next generation, they are setting up churches with several men that are leading and overseeing that congregation. And so in the apostolic period, We, of course, have the presence of the apostles. They are providing writings that will, of course, become very important for the second, third, fourth generation and onward, even to today. And they are establishing congregations that have multiple leaders for the oversight of those congregations.